It seems like every time I make one of these videos, my process has completely changed, and it's been long enough now that I'd say it's time for a new one. For this illustration, I combined all the things I felt worked for me in my chroma core recap video, working on a process that's fun, efficient, and gets results that I like. My first step is very rough sketching, figuring out what sort of scene and composition I want. After coming up with a general idea, I moved on to creating a small grayscale thumbnail painting. It's a good idea to use grayscale in these early stages so that you know the values are readable, and your art won't rely on color to make sense. I added color to this thumbnail with a couple blending mode layers after that. I tend to start with a color layer and then an overlay layer. If the thumbnail looks good when you view it very small, then you can feel good and confident that your final illustration will probably turn out okay, since a huge part of it is already done. For interiors especially, a quick way to establish perspective is by bringing in grids and transforming them to fit the environment you want. In this case, a floor, walls, and staircase. On a new layer, and with all the other layers set to low transparency, I start a new, cleaner sketch. This sketch layer is eventually hidden, so best not to worry about details. Instead, just basic, energetic shapes. I think in hindsight, I could have kept this much more loose and simple than I did. If you struggle with the same thing, it helps to increase your brush thickness. At this point, Photoshop froze. Oh joy. This doesn't happen to me too often, but when it does, I take a screenshot before restarting the program so that I can at least have my previous progress to reference. And in this case, since I was working on the sketch still, I lined up that screenshot with what was left of my sketch and traced over it. If you were starting your painting in grayscale, you could start filling that in underneath the sketch, but since I already had established colors from my thumbnail painting, I decided to color pick straight from that and skip some steps. To make future steps easier, I kept the filled-in colors of the characters on separate layers from the environment. I don't typically like working with too many layers, but it's a good idea to at least keep the background separate from everything else. After that, I hid the sketch layer and focused on just painting for a while. I locked my character color layers so that I could only paint inside the character silhouettes, and while still not getting into too much detail, used some more painty and textury brushes. When painting the background, I unhid my grids so that the perspective would stay consistent. If things feel a little flat and bland, you can breathe some life into the scene with overlay layers. I made overlay layers above and clipping into each of my painting layers, and with a big soft airbrush, added in some warm brightness and darker shadow areas. If you're happy with the change, you can merge these overlay layers down into the painting layers. At this point, I made a new layer on top of everything else for adding in some line detail. Unlike the previous sketch layers, I'm not going to hide this one. Some of these lines will still be visible in the final illustration. Instead of adding lines to every part of the scene, I've kept it to mostly just focal points, areas of importance that are going to have more detail than the stuff around them. For areas of less significance, like the background, it's better to avoid too much sharp detail and instead keep it softer. I wanted the stairs to be made of stone brick, and at this point realized they felt a bit too light. Blending modes make it really easy to change how dark or light something is, so in this case, I used a multiply layer to darken that area. Especially for interior environments like this one, I like to make lasso selections and then use a brush with a paint stroke look to add fun, painted looking texture. It's a great quick way to make a surface that otherwise would be pretty flat and plain a bit more interesting. I took advantage of this, especially in this painting from chroma core this year. Next, I felt the background area by the owl character could use just a bit more contrast, so I added in some light hitting the bookshelf with a layer set to hard light. Then I flipped my canvas and noticed the other side of the image was feeling a bit empty, so I added some plants down there to make the composition feel more balanced. Well, I do use some pretty unique brushes in my backgrounds especially. For things more in the middle and foreground areas, I'll use a basic pressure opacity round brush more than anything else. Compared to the more more rough, textured brushes, I like the sharp, in-focus look that you can get from a simpler brush like this. Really, all that's left to do from here is start adding details and color adjustments, so I just like to merge all of my layers at this point, with the exception of these blurred foreground elements that I've added, which I don't want to touch or paint on top of. This is a good point to do some more soft airbrushing with an overlay layer, and after making adjustments to my colors and values, I make a new layer which I name Paint Over, and start adding the final touches. I haven't used this brush setting called Wet Edges before, but I like the subtle, crispy look it adds to the round brush, so I tried using that for some of these details. I also use automatic lasso fill. It's a good way to make some nice shapes quickly. Finally, I felt I was finished with the details, so I added some noise, and then left this for a few days. Of course, after looking back at it, I noticed things I didn't like. It first seemed slightly too washed out to me, so I raised the contrast a bit, and also felt like there should be something added in this area to fill in this gap and create this curve going around the scene. I settled on these ivy sort of leafy vine things, and then called this done for real this time. Here's the last process walkthrough I made if you'd like to see a different sort of process. Thanks for watching!